Reinventing Normal with Landini.
Hello, I'm Mark Landini and you're listening to Reinventing Normal. It's a chat about innovation, innovative thinking and the business of design and business. Today I'm joined by futurist Richard Watson, who's authored 5 books about the future, including Digital versus Human, published in 2017. Richard is currently Futurist-in-Residence at Cambridge University, a visiting lecturer of both the Imperial College and London Business Schools. He's the founder of NowandNext.com and co-founder of Thinking Aloud. And he's one of the people behind the Sci-Fi nights at the Royal College of Art. In this chat, I reflect with Richard on COVID's acceleration of digital, the likely consequences of this new work from home reality on cities, and more importantly, its effect on our future mental health and well-being. So let's get into the future. Well, welcome, firstly, Richard. Welcome. Thank you very much for doing this. It's strange, we kind of met, I'm pretty sure we met in my studio about 100 years ago.
We met in London, I think, originally.
Did we?
So more than 20 years ago. Yeah. So it was EDR and Patrick Smith and Rooney Gustafsson and all that lot.
Oh, right. You were part of all that mob, were you?
I was that mob. And then we met in Sydney. So was it Surrey Hills? I can't remember. It's 20 years ago.
Surrey Hills, yeah. In our studio, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's right.
But that was pre your futurist days. So I guess that's my segue to asking you, because I've got a few friends that are futurists, and none of them have actually answered this question, largely because I never asked it. But what exactly is a futurist and what do they do?
Well, I mean, it's technically futurologist, I think, because obviously there was that early 1900s art movement, which was futurism. Although, interestingly, there's quite a crossover with futurists and futurologists in the sense of this sort of adoration of technology, love of speed. From memory, the futurists also rather liked war and didn't like women, so that's not the same. But putting that to one side, I guess futurists think, and I think critically, you have to write about the future, because otherwise, how does anyone know? Or at least you've got to speak about the future. You can't just sort of think to yourself. The problem you get into very quickly, though, is what do you actually mean by future? Is it 5 seconds time or is it 50 years? And I think a lot of stuff that's called futures isn't. It's basically the extrapolation of current trends and people looking 3 to 5 years ahead. And I can be guilty of that. I think you've got sort of people doing the trend work, and you've got science fiction at the other sort of side of things. And I think proper futurism sits in the middle. And I would say you've got to be thinking somewhere between about 10 and 20 years out. I think if you go less than about 3 to 5, you're just talking about next Wednesday most of the time. If you go more than about 20 or 30, you're getting into science fiction territory, and the problem is it can get quite silly quite quickly. But there is a sort of sweet spot, and you've also got to sort of escape the gravitational pull of the present. So you've got to push it out quite a long way. But I mean, in terms of what I do, I just think about the distant future, write about it, talk to people about it. Although actually, I mean, most of the time it's an excuse for people to think deeply about what they're doing right now. That's the sort of my discovery over the last 20 years is it's rarely about the future. It's an excuse to stare out the window for a week.
So what they're doing right now, or what they're doing right now?
Well, there you go. See, we're encountering the problem. We're getting into physics now. So, I mean, I think it's just thinking deeply about, what you're doing and where you're going. And if I can facilitate that, so much the better.
So is it predictive, or from a business point of view, because this podcast is aimed at businesses, is its use to businesses where not to go, or how to guide their future towards where they could or should be going, as opposed to must be going because of the trends are so powerful?
You'll never get the future 100% right. I mean, in fact, you won't even come close. But I think if you spend time thinking about it, you'll hopefully avoid being 100% wrong. So that's the sort of the nature of the game to some extent. And I think the really innovative companies don't worry too much about what they think is going to happen. They're inventing their own future, and everyone else can sort of fall in line with it, if you like.
We were talking to a client in America, and we were one of two people who were presenting trends to help them determine where they should be evolving their built environment over the course of the next few years. And our point of view was based more in the past and where their roots were and where their core values had been and where they came from and what that enabled them to build historically. The other agency that was presenting was saying, well, this is the way it is at the moment, and largely talking about digital technology and its influence on a particular generation, and therefore you should go that way.
Well, the problem with that is where it is now might not be where it is tomorrow, and technology has a habit of changing rather rapidly. I think you're on much safer ground basing it on your history and your identity, which is essentially unchanging. I mean, it's a bit like, I think you've got to have a vision. You've got to have a thought of where you're trying to get to. It's a bit like going sailing. You've got to work out where you're trying to go. And clearly the winds are going to change and all sorts of things are going to happen. You're going to get knocked around a bit, but you've got to have some vague idea of the direction you're trying to travel in, which may or may not succeed. But if you're constantly reacting to trends and what's going on, you're just all over the place the whole time. You're just being knocked from one side to the other, particularly with technology. I mean, I think the point about prediction, I mean, most futurists will say, I don't predict. No. Prediction is useful. It's provocation, essentially. You're trying to, I mean, I found you can sort of annoy people with predictions to the point where they actually have to start thinking, which is quite useful. You just wind them up by saying something completely outrageous. I mean, not that you don't necessarily believe in it, but you want to come up with something reasonably shocking that makes them stop and think. And that's useful.
Do you think that large organizations are very good at thinking these days, or do you think because things change so quickly? I mean, they literally change every moment that they're moving towards more reactionary state.
There's two sides to that. I mean, first of all, they're just organizations and people generally are just appalling at thinking. I mean, particularly these days, it's distracted, it's shallow, it's intermittent. There's not much deep, sustained, reflective thought going on anywhere. And then organizations, politics, what have you, it's very, very short term. They're working on 2, 3, 4, maybe 5-year cycles at the most. They're reacting, they're highly reactive. It's quite rare that somebody sets out a grand vision that's going to take 20 years to complete. And actually that's what we need more of. I mean, that's we can maybe come to this towards the end or something, but we suffer from a really serious lack of vision at the moment. And I think that's where a lot of the current anxiety is coming from. People genuinely have no idea where anything's going.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's been my experiences that there are few business leaders. I mean, there are exceptions and most of them are geniuses, but there are few business leaders that I am intimately aware of that seem to actually do anything other than react. And that may be to do with the speed of change and the amount of information that we are constantly being bombarded with. For example, I use that segue because we're actually meant to be talking about the future of the workplace. And as I mentioned to you in our email chat, I was very impressed with Mr. Arthur C. Clarke's 1962 or 64, I think it was, prediction, which I saw on YouTube in black and white, where I think one of the first satellites had been launched. And he very sanguinely said, well, this is going to change the world quite significantly. And more importantly, it will change cities, because cities will no longer become places where you need to physically meet. And meetings will be able to be held from a beach in Hawaii to a restaurant in Venezuela. And therefore the physical will disappear and people will be able to communicate from literally wherever they are to wherever they choose to in real time. And therefore cities will no longer have a place. Now this was 60 years ago, and he kind of got it right, didn't he?
Well, first we are suffering from the problem, and I suffer from this in a positive way. people only seem to remember things you've got right. They conveniently forget everything you've got wrong. And the trick to some extent is to be like Nostradamus and just come out with loads of stuff that's incredibly vague with no timing attached. And you will eventually get things right. People will remember those and forget all the others. I mean, he was, quite a visionary. And there's, you can look at science fiction writers like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and people like that. And a lot of them have been very much on the money. I mean, their timing is usually considerably off, but they can be very, very accurate. The problem, I suppose, with some of these people is that they do tend to only focus on technology. And I'm sort of reminded here of Zuckerberg and his metaverse a bit. There's a sort of adoration of technology and almost a loathing of humanity here. And I think, if we do literally abandon cities and offices and physical connection, we're already heading for a whole pile of trouble, in my opinion. We are inherently social. And life is rich because of its sociability. And if we all just sort of work from the spare bedrooms and never go out and have everything delivered to the door, I sort of worry, shall we say.
Well, I mean, we're at one on that point. I completely agree with you. I mean, I guess what COVID has done is speed up that prediction or make that prediction required in a sense, because we've had this technology for some time that we're using now. But we used to use it less frequently because we used to, as you quite rightly say, as social animals, would commune in places of work, workplaces called offices, and studio, in my case, a studio, because we like to make it sound a bit fancy. But essentially places where we would commune and we would talk and we would share ideas and so on and so forth, physically. But now we are forced to be less physical. And in this very short space of a few months, we've all decided that we quite like that, or a large amount of us have decided that we quite like that. And even corporations. I mean, we work with a company called Aldi, who have are now in place a dictum where you only have to go to the office twice a week.
I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I fail to think of a single thing that's happened with the pandemic that wasn't happening already. I mean, in terms of working from home and telecommuting, and the BT were talking about this 40 years. It took broadly 40 years to this. I mean, it was happening pre-pandemic, but it wasn't happening a lot, largely because of a lack of trust more than anything else, I think. And yes, it's sort of deepened and accelerated, and you kind of wonder what we'd have all done actually without Zoom and Teams over the last 2 years. But I think now everyone's pretty burnt out from it. Having said that, this whole work from home, do it all virtually, it does suit certain types of people. I mean, I know of offices. I mean, I'm thinking of one particularly in Sydney that I really shouldn't name and won't, where some people that are in the sort of the strategy side of things, they're really quite happy working from home. And then there's other people that in other areas in the business that are desperate for human contact and want to sort of physically show things and all the rest of it. And I think sales teams, for example, I think probably need that camaraderie, and they need to be in the same place making a lot of noise. And it's introvert versus extrovert, and it depends not only on the type of personality but the type of organization. I think what probably is dead now, I mean, bear in mind, about a year or so ago, bit over, people were genuinely talking about the death of the office, the death of work, the death of the handshake, which was such a sort of knee-jerk reaction, such a sort of linear extrapolation from very recent experience. And that is rightly looking absolutely ridiculous. But the idea of one or the other, I think, is out the window. I think we are entering a period where there's going to be a lot more personalization around how people work, where they work, how they work. And to some extent, you'll be able to pick what you want to do, although it's very scenario dependent. I mean, I remember in Sydney, when would it have been? It would have been 2006. I can't remember. It was either PwC or it was one of the big accountancy firms. There was some poor chap was in charge of the graduate intake, and they were all moaning about the fact they had to wear suits, get haircuts, wear ties. The coffee was shit. Why can't we have better donuts? When am I going to be a partner? And the global financial crisis hit in 2008, and they basically all shut up. And they all got haircuts, put on suits, ties. Nobody mentioned partner. The coffee was fine. So this idea of it, and the locus of control shifted. And It depends, really. I mean, if employment starts rising here and people are going to start laying off people in numbers, I suspect everyone will be flying back to the office, because those, you're going to fire the people you don't see first, I suspect. There's huge issues with onboarding of people to do that virtually. The water cooler culture, innovation, just general culture is very tricky to maintain physically. I mean, I remember another great anecdote that I still use was, I think it was National Foods in Melbourne in the, oh God, mid 2000s. And there was a marketing director who was about 45 moaning that her department was almost always empty. And she eventually grabbed a 22-year-old woman and said, I'm just curious, where do you all keep going? And the 22-year-old's reaction was, why are you so obsessed with the physical presence thing? And you had a sort of clash of generations there. So you have the sort of 45-year-old who I think was of the opinion that, I can't manage you unless I can see you physically. You have to be here for me to manage you. And then you have the 22-year-old who just thought, well, I do my job really, really well. It's just I happen to do it at 2 o'clock in the morning, lying naked on the bed watching Law and Order. So what? And they're both right and they're both wrong. And we need to find a sort of sweet spot in the middle of those two things, where you have some flexibility. I mean, I think this idea of the sort of this new neo-feudal idea of you have an office and everyone comes there and gets there for sort of 9 o'clock in the morning and they stay there till 5, and that's seen as productive. That's a sort of hangover from factory production where, yeah, sure, if you weren't on the production line, you weren't very productive. And the more time you spent there, the more productive you were. But if you're engaged in knowledge work, in brain work, you could well have the best idea you have all month lying in the bath at 2 in the morning. So what? And it's just getting that balance right. And we're struggling a bit. And it's also too early to say. All sorts of things could happen. So I think you'd be very brave to make any definitive predictions about anything at the moment, quite honestly.
You touched on something, though, earlier on, which I think is very important, which is a question of intergenerational trust. Normally the older people are the people who are running companies. And I'm guilty as hell of this. Pre-pandemic, we were pretty flexible. We allowed people who had babies to work from home and people who, needed to leave early and so on and so forth. But niggling in the back of my head always was, well, I wonder if they're doing their job, or I wonder if they're going to skive off. And this whole thing of trust is a bit like, it goes back to the social. I was thinking about, I was a musician many, many years ago, and I played in a band, and you never played in 2 bands. It was very rare for anyone to actually be able to actually be a member of more than one musical band, because it was seen to be, you're not part of the group anymore. You're not physically part of the group. Therefore, trust, in my view, is actually really kind of central to that, and particularly when it comes to employment, because you're paying someone and you expect them, as you say, to turn up, because that's the way factories and that's the way civilization evolved. Now, on the other hand, we're allowing people to have an idea of the bath at 2 o'clock in the morning. Is the next stage of that naturally to actually work for multiple bands, to play in many different groups, to actually at the same time be employed by multiple different people? Now, I know consultants exist already, but do you think that will spread into the broader sort of employment situation?
I think it's already a thing. I think if you are in demand for something, and it's probably tech related these days, and you're probably quite young, you may well work for more than one organization. Actually, it reminded me of another thing. There was an example, I think, in the States 10 years ago, where somebody started working from home and realized he could outsource his own job without his employer noticing. So he then got another job and outsourced that one. And I think he was only caught when he did it a third time. The problem, I don't think there's anything wrong with that in a sense. Although, again, how do you create a coherent culture if you've got this fragmentation? How do you, how does the identity fit there? It'd be a bit like, the Mormons, I think it's the Mormons do it, don't they? It's hard enough being married to one person. You imagine trying to keep 4 different partners happy. It would do my head in. So I'm not totally convinced. I think it is a thing and it will be a thing, but it's not going to be a big thing, I don't think. And again, it comes back to the idea of workers, of community and identity, and there's a limit to how far you can fracture that. The really strong cultures and relationships are sort of with one organization, really, I think.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with you. I mean, I think it depends on for whom you're working on what you're working on. I mean, we use a lot of freelancers, so it exists already. We will use people who will work with our competitors, but when they're working with us, they're working with us, and they're bound by the legislation that we put in place, from a legal point of view.
But it's also around, we talk about trust, and it's about relationships, and it's very hard to build a relationship online. I mean, once you've got the relationship, you can keep it going, but to build from scratch online is pretty tricky. And if you're in the sort of consulting area where you're paying a lot of money and you're paying for advice and trusted advice, it's not going to go down too well if every sort of month you're talking to somebody else. It's a bit like going to a doctor, or it used to be with bank managers. There was somebody that, had a relationship going back 30, 40 years. They knew you intimately. They understood, what you weren't saying as well as what you were saying. And that was really good. And these days, every time you show up to the doctor, certainly in the UK, it's a different one. And you have to start from scratch the whole time. It's deeply inefficient in some ways. So I'm pretty cynical about that going forward.
Okay, so let's move on to the physical, because that's kind of what interests me. One of our mantras is that we design places for people. One of my earliest memories, which probably has informed pretty much everything that I do thereafter, was going to the market 3 times a day with my aunt in Italy, in Rome. And when I asked her why she did it, she said that she didn't do it to buy a product. She went there to gossip. And to meet her friends and to have a coffee and to flirt and do all the sort of things that she could do now because her husband had died. And he didn't allow her to do previously because he was only allowed to go out once with a headscarf on. So community, I think, is incredibly important. As you said earlier, we're social people. But the communities that we spend time in will change as workplace fractures. We will be working more from home, as you said before. A lot of my team work from their bedrooms. They like it. They like to be able to do that. So what has happened is the place that you lived in the morning and the evening, which became a sanctuary from work, because work has always been central and more important to anything else in the last couple of centuries. That place of sanctuary is now changing. And some people have large enough spaces to be able to not work in their bedroom, but to be work in the spare room next door or whatever. Not everyone does that, particularly young people, obviously for obvious reasons. So do you feel that, because we do, we're actually considering redesigning our studio at the moment, which you visited many years ago. It was a place of largely of processing, because we come up with ideas quite quickly and then we have to work those ideas through to a point where they can be built. So a large percentage of what we do, because we come up with ideas quickly, is actually a processing thing, a factory thing. A lot of that processing is now being done not in our studio, but actually in people's bedrooms or in their homes. Therefore, what we're considering is that actually our workplace, where we're asking people to come to 2 or 3 days a week or whatever it is, should be actually more like a home than a workplace. And by that, I don't mean it should have slides and bouncy castles and table tennis tables, which I think is a very facile kind of sort of last century kind of approach to the workplace, but a place that can facilitate conversations in a human way, whether that's through the preparation of food or literally sitting up on a sofa, actually interacting in the way that you do in a more relaxed manner. And therefore work becomes more like home as home becomes more like.
Yeah, I'm worried about that because, the working from home became living at work, and, people working longer and longer hours. They never switched off. And I'm worried about the erosion and potentially complete loss of boundaries. And you worked hard, you came home and you relaxed and everything switched off. And that was already being destroyed by email and mobile phones when it was very easy to get hold of people. And the pandemic seems to have made that even worse. I think you're absolutely right about conversation and facilitating that. I'm not sure you necessarily have to I mean, I remember there was a period about 10 years ago, all the banks in the UK were trying to make their branches look like kitchens or living rooms. And you go, maybe, maybe not.
No one
And
trusts the bank to do
working from
anything.
home is great if you've got the space or it's just you. But you try that with a couple of toddlers and a dog, and it's a whole different ball game. But I do think there needs to be separation between work and this other place. I mean, all you really need, I think, is a bloody good kitchen and a bar at the end of the day or something. I mean, I remember, what was that ad agency in London that was experimenting with this? The Shite Day spin-off. I can't remember what they were called.
It
And
was
they're
probably
actually,
a barrel thing.
oh God, St. Luke's.
That's Luke's, right? Yeah.
And they went as far as I remember. I think they started putting beds in so people could work late, and particularly on the all-nighters. But as from memory, the bedrooms were next to the bar, and you can imagine what happened. And it was all a great idea to begin with. My broader worry, though, I mean, you touched on something really important there, I think, which is around your grandmother. And I worry about, I haven't been to Sydney for a few years now, thanks to the pandemic, but in the UK, I worry about where retail's going. Not so much work, but it's all self-checkout, and there's no conversation, there's no people, there's no. I mean, Sainsbury's is the most sterile experience you can imagine now, and there's just this beeping going on the whole time, and it's the apps. You couldn't get further away from an Italian market if you tried. Everything's covered in plastic. There's no communication. The banks here are the same. They're just pulling out all of the people. I mean, sort of Mark Zuckerberg's perfect dream, really, just get rid of all physical interaction. And I think there's a real hunger to get that back at some level and create spaces that do facilitate interaction and conversation. And particularly if you are working from home, somewhere really rich where that stuff happens. And I mean, really, I guess what you want with offices is somewhere that people really want to go. I mean, you don't want a crappy office in a dreadful location full of dull people. Who'd want to go there? And particularly if the commute, by the way, is horrendous. And in the UK, it wasn't the office that was pissing people off. It was the enormous commute with this unreliable transport network. But if you've got a really great office that's got all the sort of, great seating and sofas, and you've got a kitchen and there's a bar for late at night, and there's some really interesting people talking about their work in there, and it's in a really convenient spot that's got all sorts of fun stuff around it, which a lot of the time might be better than where you live, by the way, because you're living in a broom cupboard. I think that's not going anywhere. I think we're going to get more and more of that. We're just going to get rid of the dross, and create some really, I hope, really, really great spaces. The problem with people like banks, obviously, is they're just trying to reduce cost the whole time. To the point where, I mean, I'm about to move my bank after 40 years because I can't put up with it anymore. It's just, although where do you go? I just can't deal with it anymore. It just drives me mad the way they're operating.
And you deal with leaving, because I mean, banks basically tie you into so many different. I mean, banks are a little bit like. I mean, you touched on, without possibly even knowing it, on Jeff Bezos just then when you talked about Just Walk Out, which is a technology which he invented. Often people think mistakenly that Bezos is a retailer. He's not. He owns the world's best delivery system, and he noticed that one of the problems with physical retail in terms of delivery was that people hated queuing at checkouts, and so therefore he invented something that got rid of those. I read something he wrote recently, or it's reported that he wrote recently, is how does he employ people? And he said he likes to employ people who admit they're wrong, as opposed to say they're right all the time, because he believes that actually understanding where you make mistakes is more important than actually having the confidence not to make those mistakes. And largely speaking, I imagine that's how Amazon Go was developed. No, I've lost my train of thought now. So
let me pick up on that, because I mean, talk about Arthur C. Clarke. I remember an ad for IBM 20 years ago with a guy in a long grey coat that appeared to be shoplifting and just walked out, and they totally saw this technology coming. The problem with this, again, there's a generational overlay here, which I think we need to dwell on, which is that younger people tend to have shorter attention spans, partly because they're brought up with devices that reward that. And there, I think, yeah, they hate queuing. They want to be in and out. They're on a bit of a mission to go somewhere else. But there's a small number of them, and they haven't got much money globally. The action is with 55 plus. They've got a lot of time on their hands and tons of money. And a lot of them in older generations, which are growing substantially globally. There might be an 80-year-old woman that lives on her own. I mean, a lot of people are going to live on their own in the future because their partners died off, etc. And you are removing potentially the only bit of human interaction they've had all week, which is the checkout woman or man and the queue, and you're getting rid of that. Or going back to banks, I used to work at Imperial College.
No, sorry, I've got to interrupt because before I forget my train of thought, you reminded me of it, is that for a long time, I was a great supporter of this just walk out technology because queuing is a nasty thing. But actually, in the last few weeks, I've quite enjoyed queuing at the checkout. I've quite enjoyed looking around and just slowing down for a few minutes. I've quite enjoyed having a chat to the, I can't say checkout chick, can I? I have to say person.
No, we can't say that anymore.
Well, I can say what I like, actually. I'm not going to be told what to say. But nonetheless, I like having that conversation. And I remember thinking literally the other day when I was in the supermarket, how much better that 2-second interaction was than perhaps just walking out. And so I basically reevaluated my previous thought that actually what he'd done is brilliant. But I think you're right.
Who was it? I think Gandhi said there must be more to life than speeding it up. And at the moment, we seem to be trading all sorts of things for convenience and speed. I mean, I remember De Bono was hired once to, people in an office block, very big office block, were moaning about how long it took for the elevators to come and how long they had to queue. And his solution was to put in fish tanks. And I mean, let's make queues interesting. Let's remove the problem, make it an opportunity. I don't know. But the bank thing, I mean, I used to go to this bank. In fact, I'm going to say who it was because I hate their guts. Royal Bank of Scotland in South Kensington, that's in London. South Kensington is the richest part of Britain, if not Europe. I mean, phenomenally expensive homes, et cetera, et cetera. And every time I went into this bank, which was being transformed into a digital bank, which meant there were no tillers, there were just machines. And there were people there were bank staff, but they were only there to teach you how to use the machines. And every time I went in there was an old man or an old woman aged about 70 or 80 that's probably worth 20 million quid, complaining about a checkbook or trying to pay something in, and I remember one of them just literally in front of me at one point, almost lost it and said, I just want to talk to a human being. And, you know, and the shift to an aging populations is very significant. And everything is being designed for younger generations. I mean, it's, you know, early COVID, the NHS didn't work on older smartphones because I think there was an assumption at some Bain or somebody or some consultancy that, well, everyone's going to have an iPhone 11. No, in fact, my parents, they're both nearly 90. They don't even have iPhones. You know, they don't have smartphones. You are removing a lot of interaction for them. And but it'll come back. I mean, this is the thing we do. We have these sort of frantic advances. And then we have these sort of rapid retreats the whole time, as far as I can work out. And half the time we're just going around in a giant circle.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're right about people making assumptions. I mean, I think at the moment I'm talking to a lot of people who are going after, you know, Gen Z. Gen Z is so much more important than anyone else, and they're looking at the numbers, but they're not looking at the wealth, nor are they looking necessarily at their influence.
They make a lot of noise, but are there genuinely that many of them? And as you say, how much money have they got? They do seem to make a disproportionate amount of noise. But again, the problem with the sort of 55, 65 plus demographic is largely invisible because most marketing departments are run by people in their 30s, 40s. There's not many 60-year-olds in marketing departments. So they just don't get it. I mean, you know, I think there's now more people aged 65 plus than under 5 globally. This is the fastest growing demographic. And yet, you know, try going into a supermarket aged 80. You know, there's nowhere to sit. The shelves are too high. You can't read half the writing on the packaging. It's too small. You can't open half the packaging if you've got arthritic hands. It's just designed by 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds. They've got no idea. Oxford Street's the same. You can't sit anywhere. I mean, yeah, there's just this sort of blind spot to that sort of older generation. I mean, you know, we can't upset anyone these days apart from older people. We're perfectly happy to upset them.
Well, we talk a lot about, possibly because when I was growing up, I spent a lot of time with very old people who I gained, I think, a lot of insights and wisdom from, probably, and who I found very interesting. There is I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we recently redesigned David Jones here, which I know you know, and they're very famous for their champagne and oyster bar, which attracts a lot of, slightly, well, the demographic that you've just been talking about, 60 plus. The women will actually come in the morning, as they do actually at Selfridges, and actually have a glass of champagne at 9 o'clock in the morning with some oysters, and meet their mates there. And that's not considered by them to be outrageous in any way, shape, or form. We redesigned the champagne and oyster bar, and we made it out of concrete. And there was quite a lot of concern from our younger side of our client that, these 65-year-olds, by the way, which I'm very fast approaching, would find this far too confrontational. But what I reminded them of is that most 65-year-olds weren't even around in the 60s. My mother, who is 84, took me to Carnaby Street. My mother, who is 84, was there when Mick Jagger, who is roughly the same age, I imagine, was, doing his thing. She doesn't consider herself to be uncool. She actually considers herself to be very cool. Yeah. And so I think there's a kind of patronization of age by a generation that is in control. And I think that's probably why you get ping pong tables and
I guess I'm talking about accessibility more than everything, and also having a choice. So you don't have to do online banking. But I'm also reminded that, with the future, the general conversation tends to be around what's changing, what's coming, and all the rest of it. And we forget that an awful lot of stuff isn't changing, and it's largely us. I mean, I don't think the Black Death or the 1918 pandemic changed human behavior at all. And I fundamentally don't think this one will. I think given a few years, we will go back to what in fact, we won't just go back, we will be running back to how it was before. There's a great opportunity here to rebuild the world, but we're going to squander it. I think we're just going to try and bury it, quite frankly. And we will go back more or less with some differences, and work's probably the big one, more or less to how it was before. And even work, I think there'll be a general drift back towards the office, with some exceptions around the edges, would be my view at the moment, although that may change. I mean, this pandemic is far from over, so we'll see.
So what has happened, and what is clearly happening, is that lots of large corporations are allowing people to be more flexible in their workplace. Now, we were talking to a really interesting financial journalist from New York, Barbara Thau, in our last episode, and she was saying that if you think about it, if you are staying at home for just 2 days more than you were previously, so you're only going to work 3 days a week, the significance of that on where you live, the amount of time that you're spending there is going to have a significant impact on that environment. And so that's why, and local is becoming more important. People are getting to notice this.
Yes and no. I mean, I half agree with that. I think if you're not in the office in a city for 2 days a week, that has significant economic repercussions on sandwich bars, restaurants, pubs, whatever. The question, though, is, does that get replaced with a positive impact in the local community? And it might not, because everything is online and delivered. And this is a critical point, I think. The working from home thing, taken to a fair extreme, is not a problem if you then engage with your local community. But the problem is, I'm not sure people are. They are in these sort of cocoons in their own houses and don't venture out. That seems to be the direction it's going in at the moment. So the community is potentially dying. Although the great thing about early COVID was, this sort of incredible community spirit that came out of it. I mean, it didn't last that long, but we might be getting it again. But that's I guess my real worry is we just sort of move inwards and we don't physically connect with anything around us.
A lot of that's to do with temperature, though, isn't it? I mean, I haven't lived in
I don't think
years.
So.
Well, I think it is. I mean, I remember when I lived in England, I used to go to the pub pretty much every night. I like to think that wasn't because I was an alcoholic, but it was largely because that's where everyone went. And when I spoke to a landlord once and said, well, you've spent a lot of money on your pub, he said, well, yeah, it's a much more comfortable place to be than most people's homes. Most of our customers actually like being here because it's a social environment. 2, we have alcohol, but 3, because we have fireplaces, we have fires, we have places of warmth, we have comfortable chairs, which most of our customers can't actually afford. So we're actually creating a home from home, which is even nicer than their homes. And I guess coming back to my point about workplace, and I'm not suggesting a kind of facile approach to it, but I do think that the blurring of the two might mean that the office will become more like home, and as the home becomes more like office. So I just wanted to explore that a little bit more.
I mean, I think
beyond. I mean, you talk about kitchens, and I think for me, kitchens are probably, the campfire, the invention of the fire, where people could sit around and talk and share stories. It was probably the most significant things happened to mankind ever, and has driven the social interaction of man. Because of the warmth that it provided, and the social warmth that it provided as a consequence of the heat. And you find in societies where there is warmth, actual warmth, that people go out at night more. They for longer periods. Now, you live in England. I imagine it's freezing there now, and therefore it is much more convenient to have things delivered. I live in Sydney, and I actually much prefer to go to the
connection. I'm not sure that's the connection, but where I'm thinking though is the few. I mean, we might sort of find that we're going to go backwards in a sense. Everyone thinks it's this new thing. I mean, 200 years ago, half the shops in London rented rooms to lodgers. In the early 1700s, most people worked from home. It was the same. They lived above the shop. In late 19th century Paris, a third of homes sold booze. So there's all this stuff. And you look at where retail was 200 years ago, and it might be that we just sort of shift back to that, essentially. I mean, the localization thing, I think, is a really interesting thought. I think that could genuinely be the future. I mean, I'm beginning to see globalization unraveling. I think that could be very much where we go, with a sort of global virtual overlay, maybe. And that's a good thing, although it will vary by country. I mean, you can't sort of say everyone's going to be like this. It will depend.
So you touched on something that is very close and dear to my heart, which is that oftentimes, as we move so quickly towards some made-up fantasy goal of the future, we actually forget about the things that happened in the past that were actually really good. My aunt going to the market, I tell this story far too often. But it was a significant part of her life. Do you think that the future can be determined by the past, or do you think that the people in control of what the future is are so uneducated about the past that they don't even know that it exists? It's a land that never happened.
I think the past what's that? Past is prelude. What was that? Shakespeare. I mean, read a book called Prisoners of Geography. I mean, that's something that's not changing much, geography and certainly geology, and that informs how nations behave. I firmly believe that organizations, like individuals, have psychologies based on their history, based on their past. So, for example, Russia has a psychology which is all around the embarrassment of losing their sphere of influence and empire, and they want it back. And actually, England's not a million miles off that. We're still sort of lusting after this empire we no longer have. So I think the past does, I wouldn't say drive the future, but it definitely informs it. But I think the thing we're missing here in this discussion slightly is that, I mean,
you're talking about the collective emotional past of nations. I'm talking about the actual the practicality of being able to buy alcohol from someone's house. That's a wonderful idea. And that's not talked about very often. The fact that Mr. Selfridges put toilets in his he had a rifle club for women on the roof. He did all sorts of things that no one had done. He allowed you to actually touch the merchandise, which had never happened. Now, okay, that's all morphed into the world that we have at the moment. But there must be wonderful things that happened only 100 years ago that the people who are inventing our future have no awareness of whatsoever, and therefore they are being forgotten.
I mean,
and will never reappear.
innovation, that everyone's trying to find something new, and they've usually got these treasures in the attic. And if you look at the history of, I mean, the thing I'm reminded of is, the invention of the coffee shop in the 1700s. Coffee shops sold what became newspapers. And that's actually not a bad, I mean, it wouldn't really work now, but for a while that would have been quite a good idea to actually put them back in there. And I think there are so many good ideas that you could sort of plunder and sort of repurpose. The thing I was going to say there was, early pandemic, I was asked a few times about what I thought was going to happen next. And I said, and I would still say, I have no flipping idea what's going to happen next. It's moving too quickly. This was when we had Trump and the pandemic at the same time, which still does my head in. It's the wrong question. It's not what do you think is going to happen next. It's what do you want to happen next. So it's not what do you think an office should be like. It's, well, what do we want an office to be like? Let's just build it. And I think there's as I said earlier, there's a lot of anxiety around at the moment because there's no vision, there's no direction. And a lot of that would evaporate if, instead of sort of collectively worrying about what might happen and how we're going to react to it, we could collectively agree what we want the future to look like. And I think there's almost universal agreement about that to some extent. I mean, we want a future where it's sort of good for our kids and grandkids to grow up in various ways. And if we could sort of just articulate that and most of all actually draw it to some extent, that would be that a lot of that anxiety would evaporate. And that does happen. I mean, I'm reminded of a bit of graffiti on the side of the Sorbonne in May 68, which the students scrawled on the side of the university, which I can't remember exactly what it said, but it basically said the future will contain whatever we put into it today. And this idea, coming back to our original bit of the conversation, what is the future? The future is really what we decide to do next, what we decide to do this afternoon and the day after. That's how the future is built. And yes, some things are completely out of our control, but we have a lot more influence than we think in terms of actually sort of setting direction for things. And that's where I think the focus of the conversation should be. What do we want an office to look like? What do we want a home to look like? What do we want the entire country to look like? Let's set about trying to create that.
Yeah, you remind me of the mind-numbingly bleeding obvious, Douglas Adams, who I'm sure you've read.
Oh yeah.
Like his Guide to the Galaxy, when I think the protagonists had gone to a new planet where a civilization sent all the middle managers to tell them that they were actually leading the way, but in fact they just got rid of them. And after 2 years of trotting around the planet, I think it was Dent comes back and all the marketing people are sitting around a wheel, which they still hadn't released into circulation because they couldn't decide what color it should be. So who are the leaders in this world that are going to decide what we want to happen? Because I think that point you made is completely and utterly on the money. I don't see leadership anymore. I see following.
Yeah, I don't see it.
And so my last question to you, because I've taken up nearly an hour of your time, I sort of take up half an hour, and these guys have got to edit it, is if you were in charge and you were the leader and you could make all the decisions, what would you reinvent?
I would spend an incredible amount of time trying to work out what the question is.
42, apparently.
Sorry?
No, the answer's 42. What's the question?
Oh, yes, indeed. No, I mean, it comes back to sort of ancient Greece and the philosophers. It's like, what's a good life? What is a good way to live? And actually, funnily enough, March 20, where are we? Lost all sense of time. March 2020, a lot of people that started working from home, when it hit and they went home for the first time and stayed there, a lot of people re-examined their lives in the sort of way you do if you've been told you've got 6 months to live. And they were questioning whether they really wanted to work there, whether they wanted to commute, and whether they did this and that. And it kind of drifted off because it all sort of opened up again. And I think we need to get back to that questioning about, how we want to live as individuals and societies. And in terms of specifically what I'd reinvent, God, I don't know. I think community, possibly. I think human interaction. And I'm worried about the drift and the metaverse and all this sort of stuff, and smartphones and dumb people and physical connection. If I could sort of reinvent physical connection, but I'm not sure. But I'd start with the question of what it is, really, I guess.
Well, I thought you were going to touch on values then, because it seems to me that what, exactly as you say, that what March 20th or whatever it was did is actually allow us to, or enforce to us, to, or allow us to focus on what's important to us, what's valuable to us in the short period of time that we have running around this planet. What are we going to think of on our deathbed? Is it that we sent that text first thing in the morning at 3 o'clock when our phone dinged? Or is it going to be some form of other memory that was valuable to you?
I touched on this in the end of the book I wrote called Digital versus Human, which if I was well organized, I'd have behind me and I'd be able to read it to you. But it was really sort of questioning what all of this technology, what all of this progress is actually for. And, you know, who do we actually want to be was the question that pretty much ended that book. There's a great quote by E.O. Wilson, American evolutionary biologist, that says, we've got the brains of the Paleolithic, the institutions of the medieval, and the technology of the gods. And, you know, that he was saying this is not a good thing, because you've got acceleration of technology. We're pretty much still stuck with our cave person brains. And we've got to sort of work out, you know, where we want to orientate this technology, and ultimately what's it for, and what are we for. And actually, one of the great things that might come out of AI, which we haven't talked about at all, is, you know, if they do progress to broad AI, it will raise that question of, well, what is it that we can do that the machines can't? What are we ultimately for? What are we ultimately good at? And that, yeah, the values thing is hugely important. We need another hour to get onto that one. But
I wonder whether or not, I mean, as you were saying that, I wonder, because, you know, my broader question was, you know, where are the leaders coming from that are going to think that deeply about where we go, and then lead towards it? And maybe it's artificial intelligence. Maybe artificial intelligence is smart enough to actually make some decisions that are right.
I mean, the leaders are nowhere to be seen. I mean, Greta, possibly, and there's a few young people that might fit the bill. But, you know, this idea of cometh the hour, cometh the man or woman is nowhere to be seen. I mean, you'd think by now some great people would emerge from all of this, and they're just nowhere. But I think maybe eventually something will crop up, and it will also be linked to values, I think, and vision. Somebody articulating, and back to the thing we were talking about a second ago, somebody is going to articulate a better way to do this stuff, a better way to live, and they will emerge as the leader. And Greta is slightly fulfilling that, but she's only fulfilling it in a sort of small area. But yeah, there's the question: where are they? But
the difficulty in pushing against it is that you're seen as a Luddite, and it's very easy to say that. I think she's a remarkable young woman, because she doesn't really care about that. Maybe it's something to do with the way her brain works. But yeah, I think it's very hard to push back against the tide, particularly if you're a leader or have aspirations to be a leader, because it's too easy to criticize.
Yeah, people don't like people that depart from conventional wisdom. And I remember getting so much criticism 10 years ago because I was sort of questioning addiction to mobile phones and use of iPads in school, and I was called a Luddite, which first of all demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of Luddites, who are misrepresented. They weren't actually anti-technology. They were smashing up things to, basically it was collective bargaining, and they just decided to do it that way. They weren't necessarily anti-technology. But yeah, coming out with something, I mean, back to the very early thing of sort of prediction and saying something, and that Arthur Clarke video is, either everyone says, well, that's obvious, or they go, you're absolutely crazy. How could you possibly think that? But and it also comes, I suppose, back to this thing of, I mean, I could articulate what it's like to live in 50 years' time precisely. I could be 100% right. To what end? I mean, would anyone listen? Would anyone act? There's an interesting sort of sidebar thing here about who gets listened to, why, and when, and it's largely to do with status and being in the right place at the right time. You have to be a sort of middle-aged bloke in a grey suit that went to a certain university that turns up at Davos at precisely the right moment and says something, and then you sort of might get listened to, but anyone else, forget it. And unfortunately, the people that generally understand change are the sort of hippie kind of long-haired loonies that everyone just sort of sidelines because they look weird, you know. So there's an interesting debate there about who gets listened to, really, I suppose.
Crikey, we could actually run this into too many things. But we should actually have a coffee in the coffee shop when you're next here.
Oh, definitely. But we'll see how it goes, because the last thing I want to do is show up and halfway through the flight, they suddenly impose 2-week quarantine again. That wouldn't be funny.
You can come to our little local community of 500 people.
That sounds good to me.
Our little beach here in Kilcare.
That's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Anyway, Richard, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you to Lucy. Thank you, everybody.
I look forward to having that coffee.
Yeah. Okay. Take it easy, mate.
Yeah,
See you
thank
soon.
you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Reinventing Normal by Landini Associates. I'm Mark Landini, and I hope you'll tune in again next time. So until then, what normal would you reinvent?